What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So Shin Megami Tensei IV and I have somewhat of a storied history, despite not actually playing it until a few years back and not actually finishing it until just a few months ago. Long story short, this was almost my first Megami Tensei game ever, which would have predated my getting into the Megami Tensei franchise by quite a bit. Now, as to why I didn't decide to take the plunge with SMT IV back in 2013, I'm sure that the slightly higher price point, as well as maybe some of the discourse surrounding the game, turned me off from it, but it's been so long since then that I genuinely couldn't really tell you. It's just something I find interesting to consider and would maybe have set me on a very different trajectory as far as my experience with this franchise. To not repeat too much of what I've said in my past Mega 10 videos on the channel, I dabbled with some of the mainline Shin Megami Tensei games a few years back, but ended up dropping all of them, the first of which being Shin Megami Tensei IV, since this title is often recommended as a solid starting point for mainline and maybe even Mega 10 as a whole. I have some thoughts on that, but I will save those for later. And the main thing that I do want to preface the bulk of this video with is, as you may be able to tell from the title and thumbnail, I have a lot of problems with Shin Megami Tensei IV. If you have an aversion to dissenting opinions and or you just don't want to hear someone be extremely critical of a game that you may love, I would recommend going and watching something else. But I also want to be upfront and say that this is not an attempt at rage bait. I'm not trying to be a contrarian for the sake of it. I simply want to convey my thoughts and feelings on this game, despite the seemingly growing reverence for this title on the internet in recent years. So just know that even if I get pretty heated with certain points later on in the video, I am happy for those of you who do enjoy this title, because somebody has to, and it sure as hell is not me. So without further ado, let's dig into Shin Megami Tensei IV. It's very difficult to talk about even the presentation of this game without spoiling the major twist, so I'll give a brief story setup here, and then after this section, I'm not going to hold back on any spoilers as they become relevant. So the game opens up with the player character Flynn having some kind of vision or dream sequence, which is just absolutely my favorite storytelling device. Gotta love when the game starts beating you over the head from the get-go. Love that. But in reality, once Flynn wakes up from this foreshadowing nightmare, the game opens with Flynn and his childhood friend Ichigaya on their way to the Eastern Kingdom of Mikado to participate in the Gauntlet Rite, which, if I'm recalling correctly, is a regular ceremony where the samurai of Mikado determine who is worthy to join their ranks. Now, as you find your way to Mikado Castle to participate in the rite, you see a little bit of the class disparity that is going on in the kingdom between the casualries and the luxurers. Flynn and Isakar, being casualries, are looked down upon by the luxurers that you encounter in the various districts on your way to the castle. Now, once you reach the site for the rite, Isakar is denied from joining the ranks of the samurai, whereas Flynn is chosen to become a samurai, thus leaving Isakar to return to their village on his own. Following the Gauntlet Rite, Flynn is introduced to his fellow inductees, aka the main characters you're going to be interacting with through the vast majority of the game's runtime, being Walter, Jonathan, Isabeau, and Navarre. Technically, because you already met Walter and Jonathan in that shitty foreshadowing dream sequence at the beginning, there's the whole, oh, I met you in a dream. But as with many plot points throughout this game, it doesn't end up really mattering in the long run. I blame this on an attempt at onboarding, which is also something that I need to save for later. Long story short, the main goal you are given at the start of the game is to delve into the dungeon of Naraku, which is underneath the castle, cut your way through the demons that are holed up in there, and I guess ultimately prevent them from getting out, or something to that effect. This goal does evolve and change throughout this introductory segment. Beyond this, I would recommend just playing the game if you're curious, or if you've already played it, then I think it is safe for me to not reiterate something that you've already experienced word for word. So this is essentially your spoiler warning, though I'm going to save a lot of story talk for later on. What I really want to delve into is presentation, because this has a lot of bearing on the twist of Shin Megami Tensei IV. That twist being, of course, following the events in the Eastern Kingdom of Mikado, you and your crew are given the mission to delve to the furthest depths of Naraku to chase after the mysterious Black Samurai, as they call them. And so the reason why this twist has bearing on the presentation is because Mikado largely is presented in a visual novel style, with you clicking through menus to go from place to place. Whereas once you've delved through the depths of Naraku and discover the city of Tokyo sprawling underneath, the game becomes a more traditional Shin Megami Tensei game with roaming around a world map and dungeon crawling and all of that, even though there is some dungeon crawling in the early hours as well. This twist is really cool, but I do think it does make this game a hard sell without spoiling the twist if someone is not particularly compelled by the samurai motif. It was actually very bold of Atlas to pull the rug out from under players a few hours in. I'm trying to recall if the marketing for this game ever said anything about Tokyo or the sort of cyberpunk vibes going on down there. I kind of doubt it because that's a pretty major spoiler, as I was saying. And so it's tricky because I feel like cyberpunk Tokyo is a major selling point. Again, I think it's admirable, but I do think it puts this game in a tricky spot from a marketing standpoint. So I'm not terribly surprised that I wasn't drawn in back in 2013. But anyhow, the presentation itself. I did play this on Citra with an HD texture pack. Overall, I would say I like the general art direction of this game, especially the juxtaposition of traditional samurai in a sprawling cyberpunk city. I think that dichotomy is very interesting, at least on paper. While not having any problems with the game's presentation in broad strokes, there are a number of things that did kind of confuse me at the very least. First of all, being that the demon designs are kind of all over the place quality-wise. The first one I noticed was Medusa, and this was even when I dabbled with this game a few years back. Medusa's art style is just very jarring and stands out to me as feeling unpolished compared to how awesome Minotaur looks, which is the previous boss fight, of course. I mean, I'm sure that different artists design different demons, but it definitely does show a lack of cohesion and polish when it comes to the art design of the demon sprites. I will say, though, that I do love the Lovecraftian redesigns of the Archangels and Lilith, and I kind of wish more of the demons got redesigns in that vein. Ultimately, I don't think it would bother me as much if it was more consistent. It's surprising because I literally can't think of another title in maybe this entire franchise that I've played that has this issue. Another point regarding the bosses, I'm a little confused as to the consistency between encounters I would deem mini bosses versus proper bosses and the usage of the battle B1 and B2 themes. I was under the assumption that mini bosses would use the B1 theme and they would have just kind of a regular sprite appearance as with any other demon, whereas the proper bosses, which, you know, have the big introduction and stuff like that, such as Minotaur and Medusa, would have the larger sprites and use the Battle B2 theme. But then you get boss fights like Ji Wangmu, who use the Battle B2 theme and are built up a lot, but then don't have a giant sprite. And then you have Dullahan, who feels more like a mini boss, and I think uses the B1 theme, but has the highly detailed big sprite. It's not really a major gripe, just a consistency thing that confuses me more than anything, as far as who gets the big sprites and who doesn't, and then who gets the Battle B2 theme and who doesn't. I guess in reality, the B1 and B2 themes are just boss themes that are interchangeable, but those first, 5 to 10 hours before getting to Tokyo, it seems pretty consistent, and then suddenly you hit Tokyo and then it's not. Which also, I guess, goes for a lot of other aspects to the game, which we'll get into later. Generally, I find the visual novel storytelling style to still leave me wanting here, as I stated in my Strange Journey video. The portrait expressions and movements do help, but only so much, since the use of cutscenes here, if you want to call them that, is once again pretty questionable and underwhelming, largely. I stated this in my Strange Journey video, but as someone who wasn't playing these games as they released, I retroactively lament that the mainline games pivoted to handhelds for so long. It just really lessens the impact of a lot of story scenes when they are presented this way. In my opinion and tastes, of course. The atmosphere is still really solid, mainly thanks to the music, this time done by Ryota Kozuka. In a vacuum, this OST is actually one of my favorites in gaming, period, though I don't feel like a lot of the locations they represent do the soundtrack justice. It's actually soured me on listening to this OST a bit because of my overall impression of the game itself. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoy listening to this game's OST, but usually in separation of the actual game that it is associated with. Now to get into the exploration side of things. Of course, the more visual novel-oriented sections don't have much of interest when it comes to exploration, at least beyond rooms that contain a handful of NPCs to talk to. But when it does come to the bulk of the game, being more of a 3D dungeon crawler, I feel like the actual dungeons don't really do anything particularly interesting. They're mostly just hallways with different set dressing, and even then, it just doesn't really do it for me. Maybe there's a keycard puzzle here and there, but the dungeon crawling stays pretty basic all the way to the end of the game, which is kind of a shame for a series that, especially at the time, did present itself as being a dungeon crawler proper. And I suppose you could argue that Tokyo itself has a sort of dungeon-like design philosophy going on with how convoluted it can seem to maneuver, though if I'm recalling correctly, most of the time you're exploring a particular district and then you move on to the next one. Now, I think a major factor that makes the general exploration and maneuvering of these locations tedious is the way that enemies in the overworld are handled here. And this may seem surprising as someone who has many times in the past stated that I tend to prefer enemies in the overworld over random encounters generally. Though in the Megami Tensei games I've played with random encounters, you typically have the radar that shows you how close you are to your next random encounter, which to me makes random encounters much more tolerable compared to games that just spring them on you without any indication. I think knowing when a random encounter is going to pop pop up greatly increases the tolerability of such a system. But when it comes to the overworld enemies in SMT IV, I find the spawns to be inconsistent and obnoxious. I know they're intended to catch you off guard and are, I guess, intended to be more like random encounters in that they can spring on you without much warning. In my opinion, if you're gonna do encounters in the overworld, then it should be in a fashion that you can react and avoid them if you want to, because isn't that kind of the point? Otherwise, it's just random encounters with extra steps. I actually found it to be way more obnoxious here than in the Mega 10 games I've played with random encounters. Thankfully, but also unfortunately, these overworld encounters can be trivialized by just simply saving and loading, which in this game you can do literally anywhere. In a vacuum, I don't have a problem with this, but in a game that is still presenting itself as being more of a survivalist dungeon crawler, I don't think that the only method of saving being at your leisure was a good choice, especially when it does trivialize the entire encounter system. And there are other gameplay factors I'll get into in a bit that build on this point, but the last thing I want to say about the more exploration side of things is the side quests in this game feel kind of like filler garbage to me, and also seem largely unnecessary because of how horrendous the difficulty curve in this game is. Which brings me into more of the combat side of the gameplay here. This is also where I'm gonna probably get pretty heated, so brace yourselves. As much as I love press turn as a core combat system, there are way too many other factors to SMT IV's combat and balancing that I dislike for press turn to save the overall combat experience. First and foremost, Naraku presents an extremely false sense of what the rest of the game's difficulty is gonna be like. So much so that it actually kind of confuses me why this game is recommended to newcomers, because Naraku will kick your teeth in over and over and over again, but then once you get past it and into Tokyo proper, the game is a complete breeze. And to me, this is just poor balancing. There's no option to start on hard mode, so no, I won't be factoring that in. I need to at least enjoy playing through a game on the base difficulty to want to replay it on a harder difficulty. And I imagine that that harder difficulty would make Naraku even more insufferable, but then perhaps contrast that with Tokyo actually being somewhat balanced instead of just being a cakewalk. Now, why is it that Tokyo becomes a cakewalk very quickly? So first of all, you get 5 points to allocate per level, which is obscene. In addition to most of the stats being largely pretty useless, I'm a little confused as to why strength and dexterity are separate. It seems kind of wasteful to me in that way. And from what I understand, looking into it after the fact, is that it's better to just invest into dexterity, maybe? I just ended up ultimately pumping the vast majority of my stats into magic, especially because you can learn any skill your demons know via whispers, which grants extremely easy access to perfect coverage on Flynn, and also puts you so far ahead of your demons as far as stats and skill selection that your other demons actually feel pretty useless by comparison. You might be able to get some utility out of them, but the power discrepancy, even by the mid-game, was like obscene. Now, another factor contributing to this game's horrendous balancing is I found that resistances, and therefore armor, hardly even ever matter, which is a complete antithesis to everything that I had come to learn about the press turn games. If anything, weaknesses and resistances are like the core of what makes press turn function. Compared to the other mainline titles, and even Digital Devil Saga, which also uses the press turn system, I was going out of my way to try to cover my weaknesses with resist skills and whatnot. In this game, yeah, it just didn't prove to ever really come into play. I rocked the standard samurai garb until I got the Black Demonica, and then I just rocked that till the end of the game, and it hardly ever came up as an issue. And I also think that most of the armor looks goofy as fuck, so I don't see why I would voluntarily change from the samurai outfit or Black Demonica, which not only look way cooler than everything else on offer, but also because there's hardly a tangible gameplay benefit to switching up your armor at all. It's really strange just how many different armor pieces and stuff that are in this game that both aesthetically and functionally are just useless. There are a couple exceptions to this, but they are exclusively from the early game, so I think the point more or less still stands. In preparation for the early major boss fights, since I had fought them in my previous run, I did buy armor with the intention to resist their elemental affinity, specifically buying a fire-resistant armor for Minotaur. And funny enough, I actually ended up beating him on my first try, which was pretty cathartic considering how much trouble he gave me those few years ago. Medusa this time around was the one that gave me a lot of trouble, actually. Part of this was because I had confused her weakness. I knew it had something to do with force, but I couldn't remember if she used force magic or if she was weak to force magic. So I ended up having to double back and like prepare a little bit more extensively, but I did, I think, buy another set to resist her. And then once arriving in Tokyo, it wasn't really an issue. If I ever ran into something the samurai armor couldn't handle, I switched to the Black Demonica and vice versa. And as I stated before, it wasn't really much of a consideration. Now, there were several occasions where I spent a long time fusing demons, particularly to cover their weaknesses and try to give them good skill sets and all of that. But more often than not, it was less so fusing to try to counter a specific fight. It was more so about having good all-arounders, and I guess doubling up on coverage because Flynn more or less had perfect coverage throughout the game. With the exception of Hama and Muto, of course, because those are still exclusively insta-kills in this game. Not really any use there when it comes to boss fights, obviously, which made them easy exemptions from Flynn's skill set at least. Now, as for the boss fights that took me at least a few attempts, Medusa, of course, as I mentioned. Ji Wangmu did take me a few attempts as well. Kenji and Pluto also took a good number of attempts. And then I don't think Seraph gave me much trouble, but I just wanted to kind of shout out that fight. I thought it was kind of cool. But considering how many boss fights are in this game, the fact that there were only about a handful that took me more than 2 or 3 attempts is telling, and especially the big gap time-wise from Ji Wangmu all the way until post-route split. There are a few other points that I forgot to mention when recording this initially that I want to talk about now briefly. I don't think I was ever left wanting when it came to Maka, partially because I found that buying new equipment was just not really that worth it, especially as a magic build. I didn't really have to worry about buying new weapons or anything, while paying the pittance that is required to fully heal at these hunter associations, which I just think is another baffling design decision if we're considering this to be more of a survivalist dungeon crawler. While the other game's healing does scale with how damaged your party is, of course you can choose to heal individual demons in that case and not necessarily heal everyone at once. While that rarely felt like a hindrance in my other playthroughs, it still costs at least something. 100 Maka is like basically nothing, and you couple this excess of Maka, which in turn allowed me to buy any healing item that I could have possibly wanted and stay stocked on those. There were times where I would run into a treasure chest that had something valuable like a bead chain or a chakra pot, and I couldn't pick it up because I was already full on those, because there were so few times throughout this game that I felt pressured to actually use these items, which I just think is really telling of how terribly balanced this game is. They put this inventory limit on a lot of these items to, I think, partially incentivize players to use them, but also to limit you in some way, so that way you can't just carry 99 of everything and completely trivialize everything. But even then, it was trivial enough because I had 10 of whatever given item that was really powerful and had even more that I could go back and pick up. Sometimes I would even force myself to use one of these items just in case one showed up in a chest shortly thereafter, and more often than not, it did. Now, something that kind of returned from Strange Journey, despite that game being more of a throwback title and this game trying to continue what Nocturne started, you have the various apps that you can buy. Now, most of the apps are either boring as shit, like the stock increases, or seem just straight up useless compared to other ones that you can purchase on your first run. The ones that increase your skill slots are by far the most powerful, considering how easy it is to acquire skills on Flynn. It wasn't really much of a decision for me to prioritize those, and then the rest of the apps were just like, well, I have app points to spend, so might as well. A lot of them are really forgettable and just not particularly interesting. I got by just fine with only the standard negotiation option, even though there were a couple others you could purchase. The flexibility, I guess, of some of these apps could be cool, but I felt hardly any incentive to want to do that, as opposed to just increasing my skill slots so that way Flynn could get perfect coverage faster, maybe a couple buffs, maybe a heal, and steamroll the game with that. This isn't a matter of me like looking up the best strats or anything like that. I just, with my experience with many other RPGs, figured that having more skill slots was going to be the most powerful option. And given that you have all those skill slots, it seemed like a waste to go with a physical build. Now, sure, you could get, I guess, charge, a strong physical skill, and some other things that synergize with that, but just generally see a lot of skill slots, go for magic coverage was what my first instinct was. And it seemed like that was kind of the correct answer, for lack of a better term. And of course I have to mention Smirk, because it fucking sucks ass. It's a poorly implemented swing mechanic that I think was intended to prevent battles from feeling overly repetitive and or predictable, which I can understand because I actually felt some of that repetition and predictability in Nocturne at times. But I find that landing a weakness and or critical hit to gain extra turns is enough of an advantage that you don't need this extra random element that is just way overpowered, in that it guarantees a crit on your next attacking turn and also increases your evasion drastically. It's too many bonuses. This is one of those things that I think on paper, something like Smirk makes sense to kind of shake things up, but in playing other mainline titles after playing through SMT IV, I found myself not missing Smirk literally at all. I would actually get nervous whenever an enemy would land a weakness on me when I was playing through SMT V Vengeance, because I was just so accustomed to Smirk proccing, and then when it didn't, I was like, oh yeah, losing and gaining turns is enough of a punishment and or reward that you don't need something stacked on top of that, at least to that extreme. This, among some other gameplay things I'm sure that I've mentioned, and maybe some that I haven't, are, as far as I understand, balanced balanced better in Apocalypse. While I did find this game to be balanced pretty poorly in the player's favor, in the instances that you do die, which will still happen quite a bit compared to most RPGs, be it involuntary, usually thanks to Smirk, or just wanting to retry a fight because the opening turns went horrendously, usually thanks to Smirk, then have fun going through Charon's obnoxious dialogue about whether you should pay him to get revived, even though you can literally save anywhere already. So why would I ever, and I mean ever, pay this fucker to revive me when you can literally just reload your save that you can do anywhere? This is the thing that like actually pisses me off about this game. The overworld encounters are obnoxious but can be exploited with the save and load system. And then Charon, every time you die, going through his dialogue and like, oh, do you want to pay me? Are you sure? Even though you literally could have just saved like the step before. Only reason I take umbrage with this is because this game is still structured and presented as a more traditional dungeon crawler and yet gives you these tools. This is not something that I would take issue with as much in a more open-ended game that isn't really focused on that survivalist aspect, but this game feels like it almost wants to be both, but then fails at being either. It's not a particularly interesting dungeon crawler, and then when it comes to the flexibility of things, it's to an extent that does not feel satisfying to participate in. I'm sure that hard mode cranks things up to an extent, but not having that be available off rip, even just having normal mode be so much easier than the prior mainline titles, Nocturne and Strange Journey in particular, leaves this gameplay experience being extremely frustrating, but not for the right reasons. Now, to take a little bit of a breather and talk more about the story of Shin Megami Tensei IV, delving pretty heavily into spoilers. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think the setup for this game's story is incredibly strong, and I think that the juxtaposition of the traditional samurai in the cyberpunk Tokyo setting is really cool. On paper, once you get to Tokyo, it feels like hardly anything happens, and then all of a sudden you're in the third act, with Walter and Jonathan already ready to throw their lives away for entities that hardly got any build-up. You're introduced to the Ring of Gaia and Ashura-Kai, and that's pretty much it for the second act of the game. Nothing builds, there's no conflict shown between the two or anything, it's just you meet these guys and then boom, third act. Reverse Hills is chilling and all, but you go there once as sort of a, see, the Ashura-Kai aren't really the good guys, are they? And I feel like the Ring of Gaia gets even less than the Ashura-Kai do as far as being meaningful to the plot. It feels like you get to Tokyo and yeah, you do a couple of things that lead you back to Mikado. Then the characters that are in Mikado that seem like they're going to be important just kind of stop appearing and being relevant. The factions that you meet in Tokyo quickly become irrelevant. Also, if they ever were, aside from the world as a whole, but not the world as you experience it in the game, which to me is more important than whatever may have happened to 25 years prior. The snippets of Blasted and Infernal Tokyo feel like they were meant to be more fleshed out for the Law and Chaos routes respectively. That's kind of what I had assumed was the case, was, oh, you pick Law, you go through Blasted Tokyo. Oh, you picked Chaos, you go through Infernal Tokyo. That would make more sense to me and actually give more of a difference between the routes, which is something that I've generally found to be lacking in these titles, despite the focus that a lot of people put on the route splits, so to speak. But instead of fully developing Blasted and Infernal Tokyo as points for their various sides, we just get these little what-ifs that don't really do much for me, besides a lot of posturing for the moral quandaries that are present here, that I think were meant to push Walter and Jonathan over the edge towards their extreme alignments. The way those two develop is very similar to the plot in general, where it just feels like we skipped a proper second act. That's not to say that the philosophies presented here aren't interesting at times. I actually thought that what the Archangels and Lilith had to say was pretty poignant and something that I wish was built on more. Once again, these ideals are presented, and on paper they're compelling as extreme opposing viewpoints for the fight between Law and Chaos, as mainline SMT is typically about, but then hardly anything is done with these philosophies beyond their initial introduction, because once again, we just jump straight to the finale without much buildup at all. I guess having Walter and Jonathan be a little more impulsive is certainly a way to handle alignment reps, but this game reeks far too much of cut content for me to buy into that being the full vision for these characters and this game in general. And then as far as the other two, of course Navarre becomes irrelevant really quickly. He's obnoxious, and I guess him not being cut out to be a samurai is supposed to kind of be cathartic, I guess, so that way you don't have to deal with his abrasiveness throughout the bulk of the game, but that doesn't make him feel any less abrasive. I really could just do without him, to be honest. Also, Isabeau is boring as fuck, especially because of how rushed the back half of the game feels. I honestly didn't feel much of anything when fighting her. I was just ready to be done. If I had not made it a goal to finish it before SMT V Vengeance dropped, I probably would have dropped this game around halfway through, which would have been further than I had gotten previously, but in most cases, I would not have finished this game if it wasn't for wanting to see it all the way through, at least for the sake of being able to speak on it thoroughly. I also did stream the back half of it, which is usually an incentive for me to push through games that maybe I otherwise wouldn't finish. Although, in a lot of cases, when I have done that, and I have pushed myself to finish games for the sake of finishing them, it does end up leaving me with a perhaps even more negative view of said game than if I had dropped it halfway through, which of course dropping a game is a sign that you are not enjoying it in certain facets. I try to avoid generally forcing myself to finish games that I'm not enjoying after a certain point, even if I may be pretty far into them. Just because of this particular set of circumstances, here we are, and I did essentially force myself to finish this game and really did not enjoy much of it in execution. On paper, there's a lot of good ideas here. I do think that if I found the narrative to be stronger and more complete, I maybe could have overlooked some of those gameplay criticisms that I have for the sake of the story. I've definitely done that in the past for more narrative-focused games, but that's just simply not the case for me here. I know some might say, oh, well, Apocalypse is kind of meant to fill in a lot of those gaps. To me, from the outside looking in, as someone who's only played a couple hours of Apocalypse, it seems like a very band-aid solution because it doesn't make SMT IV any better as its own individual product. As far as I understand, SMT IV was never intended to be a duology from the get-go. This is not Digital Devil Saga where that was the intent, was to tell the game over the span of two somewhat shorter games. But here we have SMT IV, which I think took me, honestly, around the same amount of time as a single Digital Devil Saga game, being 25 hours-ish. But it's not like the game stopped halfway through, as in DDS1, and then you have the second half to continue with. It feels like stuff was cut out from the middle. The game's length is not something I necessarily take umbrage with, but I do think that this game only taking me 25 hours compared to Nocturne and Strange Journey's 50-ish is just indicative of something going wrong on the development side of things. I'm not particularly familiar with this game's development history or how that panned out. I do know that Apocalypse was going to be a sort of Maniacs version of 4, but then ended up turning into its own thing. In retrospect, I kind of wish they had gone and done a Maniacs version because what's here in the vanilla version of SMT IV just doesn't really do much for me. And so overall, Shin Megami Tensei IV frustrated me to no end, but not in the way that one would typically think in this series. It beats you upside the head in the early game only to all but completely relent difficulty-wise, and rewards you with a story that feels like a rough draft with whole chapters torn out. If this game ever gets re-released, it's going to need some serious changes to get me on board. I had previously stated that all it would need is some quality of life improvements on the gameplay side of things, and sure, that would be nice at bare minimum, but I say go full remake with this one, because a simple port or remaster of this title is not going to get me excited. And while I would like to give Apocalypse an honest try at some point, I'm not going to make any promises that I'll play it to completion or make a video on it, simply because, from what I can tell, it is more of SMT IV, albeit maybe a little more polished, but also with a tonal shift that I don't think I'd be super into. I feel like the selling point of Apocalypse would be if you really liked SMT IV, at least in some aspects, but even then, because of the tonal shift, I know there are fans of SMT IV that don't like Apocalypse because of story reasons. What's actually next for me to discuss in this series is Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance, which, not to spoil my thoughts on that game too much, but I feel much more positively on that title overall, even though I do have quite a bit of criticism for that title as well. But as of recording this, I did finish Vengeance, and so that should be one of the next videos I end up putting out. I am curious what you guys have to say about Shin Megami Tensei IV. I find it unlikely that many of you will share a lot of the same sentiments that I have regarding this game, or at least you're able to overlook a lot of this game's problems, or maybe you don't even view some of these things as problems. I don't know, but I'm curious to have a discussion about it down in the comments below. Just please be civil. My intention is never to like hurt anyone's feelings. This is not an attack on like any individual. I wouldn't even say it's an attack on the game per se, but it's just really my thoughts and feelings towards this game, which just happen to be very much on the negative side. There are probably more people out there that will vocally praise this game as opposed to disparage it, so just by doing simple math, you are probably more likely to enjoy this title than to not, if you have any inkling of interest in it, but your mileage may vary. Of course, I do want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.